The dust kicked up behind Jake Morrison's horse as he rode down the winding trail into Clearwater Valley. His hat was pulled low against the afternoon sun, and his weathered boots hung loose in the stirrups. At 23, Jake had already seen more hardship than most men twice his age. The drought that had gripped Texas for 2 long years had finally broken his family's ranch, forcing them to sell what little remained and scatter to the winds. Jake's saddlebags held everything he owned in the world: a spare shirt, some beans and jerky, his father's old Bible, and $43 in crumpled bills. His horse, a sturdy bay Marais named Copper, had been his faithful companion through countless nights on the range. She was getting tired now, her head hanging low as they made their way toward the cluster of buildings that marked the town of Clearwater. The newspaper clipping in Jake's shirt pocket had brought him here. A simple advertisement placed in the Denver paper by someone named M. Henley, looking for an experienced ranch hand. The pay wasn't much, but it included meals and a place to sleep. More importantly, it was honest work, and Jake had learned the value of that from his father Dot as he rode past the small town. Jake noticed how people stopped their conversations to watch him. A stranger always drew attention in places like this, especially one who looked like he'd been riding hard for days. His clothes were dusty, his face unshaven, and his eyes held that distant look of a man who'd left everything behind. The Henley Ranch sat about 3 miles outside town, nestled in a valley where the grass still showed patches of green despite the late summer heat. Jake could see cattle scattered across the rolling hills, though not as many as the land could support. The ranch house was a 2-story wooden structure with a wide front porch, showing signs of age but still solid and well-maintained. Dot as Jake approached, he noticed a woman standing on the porch steps. She was tall and straight-backed, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her dress was simple but clean, and she wore a work apron that suggested she'd been busy with household chores. But it was her eyes that caught Jake's attention. Sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. This had to be Martha Henley, the widow who had placed the advertisement. Jake had expected someone older, more frail perhaps. Instead, he found himself looking at a woman who carried herself with quiet strength and determination. She was probably in her early 40s, with lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and worry. Jake dismounted slowly, his muscles stiff from days in the saddle. He removed his hat and approached the porch with the respectful manner his mother had taught him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse from dust and disuse, "I'm Jake Morrison. I saw your advertisement in the Denver paper about needing a ranch hand." Martha studied him carefully, her gaze moving from his worn boots to his honest face. She had learned to read men quickly since her husband's death 6 months ago. Too many had come around with false sympathy and hidden motives. But this young man seemed different. There was something genuine in his manner, a quiet confidence that didn't need to prove itself with loud words or swagger. "You've come a long way," she said finally. "What brings you to Colorado?" Jake shifted his weight, uncomfortable with talking. "About his troubles. Lost our ranch in Texas, ma'am. Drought took everything. I'm looking for work, and I know cattle and horses." Martha nodded slowly. The story was familiar enough. The drought had driven many good people from their homes. "Have you worked on a ranch before, or just your family's place?" "Both, ma'am. Worked for the Circle K Ranch near Austin for 3 years before going back to help my folks. I can handle cattle, repair fences, break horses if needed. I'm not afraid of hard work." Something in his tone convinced Martha that he was telling the truth. She had been running the ranch alone since Samuel's death, with only occasional help from neighbors. But the problems were getting worse, and she needed someone she could trust to be there every day. "The work isn't easy," she said. "We've been having trouble with rustlers, and some of the fences need major repairs. The pay is $30 a month, plus meals and a room in the bunkhouse. Are you interested?" Jake's relief was visible. "Yes, ma'am. I'd be grateful for the chance." "There's one more thing," Martha said, her voice becoming more serious. "People in town might talk." A young man working for a widow woman. "I need to know that you understand this is strictly a business arrangement." Jake's face reddened slightly, but he met her gaze steadily. "Ma'am, I'm here to work, nothing more. You have my word on that. Double quotes." Martha believed him. There was something about his straightforward manner that reminded her of her late husband in his younger days. "Very well, put your horse in the corral behind the barn. There's feed and water there. I'll show you the bunkhouse, and we can discuss your duties over supper." As Jake led Copper toward the barn, Martha watched him go. She was taking a risk. Hiring him, she knew. The ranch's finances were stretched thin, and she could barely afford to pay a hand. But she was also taking a bigger risk trying to manage everything alone. Strange things had been happening lately: cattle disappearing, fences cut, and men she didn't recognize riding across her property. The bunkhouse was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wooden chair. Jake set his few belongings on the bed and took a moment to look around. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had in weeks. Through the single window, he could see the main house where a thin line of smoke rose from the chimney. When he returned to the house for supper, Martha had set 2 places at the kitchen table. The meal was simple but hearty: beef stew, fresh, bread, and coffee that was stronger than anything Jake had tasted in months. As they ate, Martha explained the situation. "My husband Samuel died 6 months ago," she said, her voice steady but sad. "Mining accident up in the hills. Since then, I've been trying to keep the ranch going, but it's been difficult. We have about 200 head of cattle, but I suspect we're losing some to rustlers." Jake nodded, understanding the problem. "How many hands did you have before?" "Samuel. And I managed with just one other man, but he left after the funeral. Sighed, he didn't want to work for a woman." Martha's voice carried a hint of bitterness. "I've been managing alone since then, with help from neighbors when I can get it." "What about the law?" Jake asked. "Have you reported the rustling?" Martha's expression darkened. "Sheriff Brennan says there's not much he can do without catching someone in the act. He's not particularly helpful when it comes to problems out here." Jake sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. Instead, he asked about the daily routine, the condition of the fences, and the areas where cattle had gone missing. Martha answered his questions thoroughly, impressed by his practical knowledge and genuine interest in the work. As the evening wound down, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. This young man seemed capable and trustworthy, and she desperately needed both qualities in her life right now. She had no idea that hiring Jake Morrison would change everything, or that the troubles she faced were far more dangerous than simple. Rustling, for his part, Jake felt grateful to have found work and shelter. The widow seemed like a decent woman dealing with difficult circumstances, and he was determined to prove himself worthy of her trust. He had no way of knowing that the quiet ranch in Clearwater Valley held secrets that would test his courage and change his life forever. The first light of dawn was creeping over the mountains when Jake heard the sound of cattle moving restlessly in the distance. He'd been working at the Henley Ranch for 3 weeks now, and his body had adjusted to the early mornings and long days, but something about the sounds outside wasn't right. Cattle didn't usually stir this early unless something was bothering them. Jake pulled on his boots and grabbed his rifle before stepping out of the bunkhouse. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and his breath formed small clouds in the cold morning air. He could see movement near the north pasture, dark shapes that shouldn't be there. His heart began to race as he realized what he was seeing: men on horseback, quietly driving a small group of cattle toward the property line. Without hesitation, Jake mounted Copper and rode hard toward the rustlers. The sound of hoofbeats alerted them to his approach, and they spurred their horses into a gallop, abandoning their theft. Jake managed to turn the cattle back, but the rustlers disappeared into the hills before he could get close enough to identify them. When he returned to the ranch house, Martha was already dressed and waiting on the porch with a cup of coffee. She'd heard the commotion and knew what it meant. "How many this time?" she asked quietly. "About 15 head, Jake replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I got them back, but the rustlers got away. They knew exactly where to find the cattle, and which way to drive them. This wasn't random." Martha's face was grim. "They'd been at it for months. Always small groups, always at night." Sheriff Brennan says there's nothing he can do unless we catch them red-handed. Jake studied her face, noting the lines of worry and exhaustion. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, why would rustlers keep coming back to the same place? Usually they hit a ranch once and move on. Martha was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the hills where the rustlers had disappeared. I've been wondering the same thing. It's like they're trying to wear us down rather than just steal cattle. Over the following weeks, Jake threw himself into his work with determination. He repaired miles of broken fencing, often finding that the damage looked deliberate rather than accidental. He spent long nights on patrol, getting to know every corner of the ranch property. During the day, he helped Martha with the countless tasks that kept the ranch running. As they worked together, Martha began to open up about her struggles. The evening meals they shared became a time for honest conversation, something Martha hadn't experienced since her husband's death. She told Jake about the mounting bills, the creditors who sent increasingly threatening letters, and the neighbors who seemed to be waiting for her to fail. Samuel always handled the finances, Martha admitted one evening as they sat by the kitchen fire. I knew we had debts, but I didn't realize how bad things had gotten until after the funeral. The cattle sales barely cover the mortgage payments. And now with the rustling... Jake listened carefully, noting how Martha's voice changed when she spoke about her husband. There was love there, but also something else, confusion, maybe even a little anger. What kind of work did Samuel do besides ranching? He asked gently. Martha's hands tightened around her coffee cup. He said he was looking into some business opportunities. He'd disappear for days at a time, sometimes a week. When he came back, he'd have money to deposit at the bank, but he never explained where it came from. Did he ever talk about what kind of business? He said it was better if I didn't know the details. That it might be dangerous? Martha's voice grew bitter. I trusted him, but now I wonder if I should have pushed harder for answers. Jake sensed there was more to the story, but he didn't want to push too hard. Instead, he focused on practical matters. What about the ranch's records? Maybe there are clues in the paperwork. Martha sighed. Samuel kept most of the important papers in his desk. I've been avoiding going through them, but I suppose I should. The next evening, Martha led Jake to Samuel's study, a small room off the main hallway that had been her husband's private space. The desk was covered with papers, ledgers, and correspondence. As they began sorting through the documents, Jake noticed something odd about the financial records. Ma'am, these bank deposits don't match what you're telling me about the ranch's income, he said carefully. According to this, Samuel was depositing substantial amounts of money every month, far more than cattle sales would bring in. Martha came to look over his shoulder, her face growing pale as she saw the figures. I had no idea. Where would he get this kind of money? Jake continued examining the papers, finding receipts for mining equipment, surveying tools and supplies that had nothing to do with ranching. It looks like Samuel was involved in some kind of mining operation. Did he ever mention anything about prospecting? Never, Martha said firmly. He always said mining was a fool's game. He used to laugh at the prospectors who came through town with their wild stories about striking it rich. Their investigation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the house. Jake immediately moved to the window, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit was dismounting from a fine horse, followed by two rougher-looking companions. It's William Henley, Martha said, her voice tight with tension. Samuel's brother? Jake had heard Martha mention William before, but always with a tone that suggested their relationship was strained. As the three men approached the porch, Jake could see why. William Henley was everything Samuel apparently hadn't been: flashy, arrogant, and surrounded by men who looked more like hired muscle than legitimate business associates. Martha opened the door before William could knock, her posture rigid with barely controlled anger. William! What brings you here so late in the evening? William's smile was cold and calculating. Hello, Martha. I was in the area and thought I'd check on how you're managing. I see you've hired help. His eyes fixed on Jake with obvious suspicion. This is Jake Morrison, my ranch hand, Martha said evenly. Jake, this is William Henley, Samuel's brother. William. barely acknowledged Jake's polite nod. "Martha, we need to talk. About Samuel's debts, about the ranch's future. You can't keep struggling like this forever." "I'm managing fine," Martha replied, but Jake could hear the uncertainty in her voice. You?" William's voice became more aggressive. "The bank tells me you're behind on the mortgage payments. The creditors are getting impatient. It would be better for everyone if you just sold the ranch now, before things get worse." Jake noticed how William's eyes kept scanning the property, as if he was looking for something specific. There was something predatory in his manner that made Jake's instincts scream warnings. "Samuel left me this ranch," Martha said firmly. "I'm not selling it." William's facade of concern slipped slightly. "Samuel's dead, Martha. You need to face reality. A woman can't run a ranch alone, especially not with all the problems you've been having." "What problems?" Jake interjected, stepping closer to Martha. In a show of support, William's cold gaze fixed on Jake. "Rustling, accidents, the usual troubles that befall isolated ranches. Things that could get much worse if the right precautions aren't taken." The threat was barely veiled, and Jake felt his anger rising. "Are you saying someone's deliberately causing problems for Mrs. Henley?" "I'm saying that ranching is a dangerous business," William replied smoothly, "especially for those who don't understand all the risks involved." After William and his companions left, Martha and Jake stood in the kitchen, both shaken by the encounter. "He's been pressuring me to sell since the funeral," Martha said quietly. "Always talking about debts and dangers, but never offering to help." Jake poured them both coffee, his mind racing. "Ma'am, I don't want to speak ill of family, but something about your brother-in-law doesn't sit right with me. The way he looked at the property, the things he said about dangers, ... "I know," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've had the same feeling, but he's Samuel's brother. Surely he wouldn't." "Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who can hurt us most," Jake said gently. "We need to be careful, and we need to find out what Samuel was really doing before he died." That night, as Jake lay in his narrow bunk, he thought about the events of the past few weeks. The rustling, the mysterious deposits, William's veiled threats, it all pointed to something bigger than simple cattle theft. Martha was in danger, and Jake was beginning to realize that protecting her would require more than just night patrols and fence repairs. He'd come to the ranch looking for simple work, but he'd found something much more complicated. He'd also found someone worth protecting, and that realization surprised him more than anything else. Martha Henley was becoming more than just his employer. She was becoming someone he cared about deeply, and he was determined to help her uncover the truth about her husband's secrets, no matter what dangers that truth might bring. The blizzard hit Clearwater Valley with a fury that hadn't been seen in years. Snow fell so thick that Jake couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him as he made his way to the barn to check on the animals. The wind howled through the gaps in the wooden walls, and he had to lean hard against the door to push it open. Inside, the cattle huddled together for warmth, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. Jake checked the water troughs, breaking the ice that had formed overnight. As he worked, he heard something that made him freeze, the sound of horses moving through the snow, their hooves muffled but still audible to his trained ear. Jake grabbed his rifle and moved to the barn door, peering out into the swirling snow. 3 dark shapes were moving among the cattle in the north pasture, working quickly to separate a group of young steers from the herd. The rustlers were using the storm as cover, thinking no one would be watching in weather like this. They were wrong. Jake slipped out of the barn and began making his way toward the rustlers, using the snow and wind to mask his approach. The cold bit at his face, and his fingers were numb inside his gloves, but he kept moving. These men had been stealing from Martha for months, and Jake wasn't going to let them get away with it again. He got close enough to hear their voices over the wind. "Hurry up," one of them called out. "We need to be gone before that cowboy comes looking." "He won't come out in this weather," another replied. "Nobody's that stupid," Jake smiled grimly. He was about to prove them wrong. "Stop right there," Jake shouted, stepping out from behind a snow-covered boulder with his rifle raised. Let those cattle go." The rustlers spun around, surprised by his sudden appearance. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of them reached for his gun, and Jake had no choice but to fire. The shot echoed across the valley, and the man fell from his horse into the snow. The other two rustlers immediately spurred their horses away, abandoning the stolen cattle. But in their panic, one of them shouted something that made Jake's blood run cold. "William's not going to like this." He said the ranch would be ours soon. Jake stood in the falling snow, watching the rustlers disappear into the storm. William Henley was behind the rustling. It wasn't just random theft. It was a deliberate campaign to destroy Martha's ranch. But why? What did William want with a struggling cattle operation? The wounded rustler was still alive, groaning in the snow. Jake checked his injury, a shoulder wound that wasn't life-threatening. "Why is William Henley paying you to steal cattle?" Jake demanded. The man's eyes were filled with pain and fear. "I don't know nothing about no William," he gasped. "We was just hired to make things difficult for the widow woman." "Difficult how? Steal cattle, cut fences, scare her into selling." "That's all I know, I swear." Jake helped the wounded man onto his horse and sent him on his way with a warning never to return. Then he drove the recovered cattle back to the barn, his mind racing with questions. William's involvement confirmed his worst suspicions, but it still didn't explain why Samuel's brother was so desperate to get his hands on the ranch. The storm continued for 3 days, trapping everyone indoors. Jake spent the time helping Martha with indoor tasks and thinking about what the rustler had revealed. On the 3rd day, while searching the barn loft for extra blankets, he made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden beneath a pile of old hay, Jake found a wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Samuel Henley's careful handwriting. Jake's hands trembled as he realized what he was holding. Samuel's private diary, hidden away where no one would think to look. The journal entries started 2 years before Samuel's death, beginning with what seemed like innocent prospecting. Trips into the hills. Samuel wrote about his love for the ranch and his worry about the mounting debts. He mentioned feeling desperate to find a way to save the property that had been in his family for generations. Then, about 18 months ago, the tone of the entries changed dramatically. Samuel had found something in the narrow canyon behind the ranch, something that made his handwriting shake with excitement. "The vein is bigger than I thought," one entry read. "If I'm right about this, Martha will never have to worry about money again." Jake read on, his heart pounding. Samuel had discovered gold in the canyon, a rich vein that ran deep into the hillside. But instead of telling Martha immediately, Samuel had decided to work the mine in secret, carefully extracting the gold and storing it safely away until he could be sure of the find's true value. The later entries revealed Samuel's growing paranoia. He wrote about feeling watched, about strangers asking questions in town, about his suspicion that someone had discovered his secret. One entry particularly caught Jake's attention. "William came by again today, asking more questions about my business trips. I don't trust the way he looks at me, like he knows something. I need to be more careful." The final entry was dated just 3 days before Samuel's death. Jake read it with growing alarm. "I think William knows about the mine. He's been asking too many questions, and yesterday I saw him riding toward the canyon. If something happens to me, I've hidden the location of the mine entrance in the one place Martha will look, inside her mother's Bible on the bedroom shelf. The gold I've already taken is buried beneath the old oak tree behind the house. Tell Martha I did it all for her." Jake closed the journal, his mind reeling. Samuel hadn't died in a random mining accident. He'd been murdered by his own brother. William had discovered the gold mine and killed Samuel to get it. But William's plan had a problem. He needed to own the ranch to legally claim the mine, which meant he had to force Martha to sell. Jake climbed down from the loft and walked to the house, the journal tucked securely inside his coat. Martha was in the kitchen, preparing dinner with movements that had become automatic over the months of struggle. She looked up as he entered, immediately noticing the serious expression on his face. "Jake, what's wrong? You look like you've seen?" A ghost, in a way I have. Jake sat down at the kitchen table and placed the journal in front of her. I found this hidden in the barn loft. It's Samuel's journal, Martha. You need to read it. Martha's face went pale as she reached for the journal with shaking hands. Jake watched her read, seeing the emotions play across her face: surprise, excitement, and finally, terrible understanding. When she reached the final entry, tears began streaming down her cheeks. "He was murdered," she whispered. "William killed him for the gold mine." Jake reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm sorry, Martha. I know this is hard to accept." "Oh." This time I thought Samuel was keeping secrets from me because he didn't trust me, but he was trying to protect me. Martha wiped her eyes and looked at Jake with new determination. "We have to find the mine. We have to find the gold Samuel hid." "We will," Jake promised. "But first, we need to be smart about this. William is dangerous, and he's not going to stop until he gets what he wants." Martha stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered ranch. "He's been playing a long game, hasn't he? The rustling, the pressure to sell, the threats. He's been trying to bankrupt me, so I'd have no choice but to sell to him. That's exactly what he's been doing. And now that the rustling isn't working fast enough, he might try something more direct." Martha turned back to Jake, her jaw set with determination. "Then we need to find that mine before he does. Samuel said he hid the location in my mother's Bible. Let's go look." They found the Bible on the bedroom shelf, its pages yellowed with age. Hidden between the pages of Psalms, they discovered a hand-drawn map showing the location of the mine entrance in the canyon behind the ranch. Samuel had marked it carefully, including landmarks and warnings about dangerous areas. "It's about a mile up the canyon," Martha said, studying the map, "in a place I've never been. Samuel always said it was too dangerous for riding." "We'll check it out as soon as the snow melts," Jake promised. "But Martha, we need to be prepared for trouble. William isn't going to give up easily, and he's already shown he's willing to kill to get what he wants." Martha folded the map and put it in her apron pocket. "I'm not afraid of William anymore. Samuel died protecting this secret, and I'm not going to let his sacrifice be for nothing." As they sat by the fire that evening, planning their next moves, Jake felt a deep sense of purpose. He'd come to the ranch looking for simple work, but he'd found something much more important, a cause worth fighting for and a woman worth protecting. The discovery of Samuel's journal had revealed the truth about the past, but it had also made their future more dangerous than ever. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to clear, but Jake knew that the real storm was just beginning: William. Henley would be back, and next time he might not be content with threats and rustling. The race to find Samuel's gold mine had become a race for survival, and Jake was determined to make sure Martha came out the winner. Spring arrived early in Clearwater Valley, bringing with it a sense of new beginnings and hidden dangers. The snow had melted from the hills, revealing the green grass beneath, and the cattle were growing fat on the fresh pasture, but Jake knew that the changing season would also bring William Henley back to the ranch, and this time he wouldn't be content with empty threats. Jake and Martha had spent the past week preparing for what they both knew was coming. They'd found Samuel's gold mine exactly where his map indicated, hidden in a narrow canyon behind the ranch. The entrance was cleverly concealed behind a rockfall that looked natural but had been carefully arranged. Inside, they'd discovered a rich vein of gold ore and evidence of Samuel's careful work over many months. More importantly, they'd found Samuel's hidden cache of gold beneath the old oak tree, just as his journal had promised. There was enough gold there to pay off the ranch's debts and secure Martha's future. But Jake insisted they leave everything hidden until they could deal with William permanently. "He's going to come back," Jake had warned Martha. "And when he does, he's not going to be satisfied with trying to scare you into selling. He knows time is running out." Martha had agreed to Jake's plan. They would wait for William to make his move, then confront him with the evidence of his crimes. It was dangerous, but it was the only way to end the threat once and for all. The confrontation came on a warm Tuesday morning in late April. Jake was repairing fence posts in the north pasture when he saw 3 riders approaching the ranch house. William Henley rode in the center, flanked by two men Jake didn't recognize, but he could tell from their appearance that they weren't honest. Ranch hands, they wore their guns low and moved with the predatory confidence of hired killers. Jake left his tools and rode hard toward the house, arriving just as William was dismounting. Martha stood on the porch, her face calm but her hand steady near the rifle leaning against the doorframe. "William," Martha said evenly, "I wasn't expecting you." William's smile was cold and without warmth. "Hello, Martha. I think it's time we had a serious conversation about your future." Jake dismounted and walked to Martha's side, his presence making it clear that she wasn't alone. William's eyes narrowed as he took in Jake's protective stance. "Still playing at being a rancher, I see," William said to Martha, ignoring Jake completely. "But the game is over, dear sister-in-law. The bank is calling in your loan, and the creditors are demanding payment. You have 30 days to settle your debts or lose everything." "That's not possible," Martha replied. "I've been making my payments." William pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I'm afraid the situation has changed. Your outstanding debts have been consolidated, and the new terms require immediate payment in full. Unless, of course, you'd like to sell the ranch to me. I'm prepared to offer you enough to cover your debts and leave you with a small amount to start over somewhere else." Jake studied the two men with William, noting how they'd positioned themselves to block any escape routes. Everything about this felt like a trap, and Jake's instincts screamed danger. "What if I refuse to sell?" Martha asked, though Jake could hear the strain in her voice. William's mask of false concern finally dropped completely. "Then you'll lose." "Everything anyway, but you'll have nothing to show for it." "Accidents happen to stubborn people, Martha. Just ask my dear departed brother." The casual reference to Samuel's death made Martha gasp, and Jake felt his anger flare. "That sounds like a threat," Jake said quietly. William finally acknowledged Jake's presence, his cold eyes fixing on the younger man. "And you are?" "Someone who doesn't like seeing widows being bullied by their own family," Jake replied, his hand resting casually near his gun. One of William's companions, a thin man with hard eyes, stepped forward. "Maybe you should mind your own business, Cowboy." "Martha's safety is my business," Jake said simply. William laughed, but there was no humor in it. "How touching. The hired hand thinks he's protecting his employer. Tell me, Jake, what do you really know about this ranch? About Samuel's death? About the real reason I want this property?" "I know enough," Jake said. "I know that Samuel found gold in the canyon behind the ranch. I know that you killed him to try to get it. And I know that you've been terrorizing Martha ever since, trying to force her to sell." William's face went pale with shock, then flushed with anger. "You know nothing," he snarled. "Samuel was my brother, and he owed me a partnership in whatever he found. He refused to share what was rightfully mine." "So you killed him," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for him to die," William said, his composure cracking. "I just wanted him to listen to reason." "But he fought me, and there was an accident. The mine shaft collapsed, and Samuel was trapped inside." "You left him there to die?" Jake said, his voice filled with disgust. "I tried to dig him out." William shouted, "But it was too late. And then I realized that his death could solve both our problems. I could claim the mine, and Martha could collect on Samuel's life insurance. Everyone would win." "Except Samuel," Martha said, tears streaming down her face. "And except me when you decided to steal everything he died for." William's hired gunmen were growing restless, their hands hovering near their weapons. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Enough talking," William said, his voice becoming hard and businesslike. "Martha, you have two choices. Sign the papers selling me the ranch, or my associates here will make sure you have a tragic accident, just like your husband." "I'll never sign," Martha said firmly. William nodded to his men, and they began to draw their guns. But Jake was ready for them. He'd been watching their every move, and he knew this moment was coming. "Martha, get inside," Jake shouted as he drew his own weapon. The gunfight erupted in a chaos of smoke and noise. Jake dove to his right, rolling behind a water trough as bullets whizzed past his head. The two gunmen had spread out, trying to catch him in a crossfire, But Jake had grown up hunting in dense Texas brush, and he knew how to use cover effectively. Martha had grabbed her rifle from the porch and was firing from the doorway, her shots forcing one of the gunmen to take cover behind his horse. The animal reared in panic, throwing off the man's aim and giving Jake the opening he needed. Jake's first shot caught the thin-faced gunman in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. The second gunman was a better shot, and his bullet splintered the wood of the trough just inches from Jake's head. But Jake had been in situations like this before, and he kept his nerve. He waited for the gunman to expose himself for another shot, then put a bullet center mass that dropped the man where he stood. William had taken cover behind his horse, a small pistol in his hand. "You can't protect her forever, Cowboy," he shouted. "There will always be others." "Not if you're not around to hire them," Jake replied, working his way closer to William's position. The final confrontation was brief but decisive. William, desperate and cornered, made a last desperate play. He grabbed his horse's reins and tried to mount up, planning to escape and fight another day. But Martha's rifle spoke from the porch, and William tumbled from his horse. Clutching his leg, Jake stood over the wounded man, his gun trained on William's chest. "It's over," he said simply. "Samuel's death is avenged and Martha is safe." William looked up at Jake with hate-filled eyes. "You think this ends anything? When I don't return, others will come looking. You've won this battle, but you haven't won the war." "Maybe," Jake said, "but you won't be around to see it." Martha joined them, her rifle still in her hands. She looked down at the man who had killed her husband and terrorized her for months. "What do we do with him now?" Jake looked at the wounded gunman, who was still alive but badly hurt, and at William, who was clutching his wounded leg. "We're going to take them to the territorial marshal in Denver. Let the law handle this properly." "The local sheriff," Martha began, "is probably in William's pocket," Jake finished. "But the territorial authorities will listen to the truth, especially with Samuel's journal as evidence." As they waited for the wounded men to be stable enough to travel, Jake and Martha sat on the porch steps, the adrenaline of the gunfight slowly wearing off. Martha reached over and took Jake's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. For believing in me, for protecting me, for helping me find the truth about Samuel." Jake squeezed her hand gently. "You don't need to thank me, Martha. You're stronger than you know. You would have found a way through this even without me." "Maybe," Martha said, "but I'm glad I didn't have to try." As the sun set over Clearwater Valley, they began making plans for their trip to Denver. William's threat about others coming was probably just bluster, but Jake knew they needed to end this threat completely. The gold mine would remain their secret until they could be sure it was safe to reveal it. For now, it was enough that Martha was free from William's shadow, and that the truth about Samuel's death would finally come to light. The journey to Denver took 3 days, with William and his wounded accomplice tied securely in the back of a wagon. Jake rode alongside while Martha handled the reins, both of them watchful for any signs of trouble. William had grown quiet after his initial threats, perhaps finally understanding that his schemes had come to an end. The territorial marshal's office was a sturdy brick building in the heart of Denver, and Marshal Thompson was exactly the kind of lawman Jake had hoped to find: honest, experienced, and unimpressed by wealth or connections. He listened carefully as Jake and Martha presented their evidence, examining Samuel's journal with the attention it deserved. "This is quite a story," Marshal Thompson said finally, setting the journal down on his desk. "Murder, fraud attempted. Robbery. Mr. Henley has been busy." William, his leg bandaged and his hands cuffed, tried one last desperate play. "Marshal, you can't believe these wild accusations. I'm a respected businessman from Denver. These people are clearly trying to frame me to cover up their own crimes." Marshal Thompson looked at William with cold eyes. "Mr. Henley, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know guilt when I see it. Besides, your wounded associate has been very talkative while the doctor patched him up. He's confirmed everything Mrs. Henley and Mr. Morrison have told me." The trial took place 2 weeks later, and it was the talk of Denver. The story of the widow who fought back against her murderous brother-in-law captured the public imagination. Jake testified about the rustling and the threats, while Martha courageously told the court about Samuel's secretive behavior and William's increasing pressure for her to sell the ranch. But it was Samuel's journal that sealed William's fate. The dead man's own words, written in his careful handwriting, told the story of discovery, fear, and ultimately murder. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. As William was led away to begin his 20-year sentence, he turned to look at Martha one last time. "You think you've won?" he said bitterly. But you'll never be able to work that mine safely. There are others who know about it." "Let them come," Martha replied quietly. "I'm not afraid anymore." The return journey to Clearwater Valley was very different from their trip to Denver. The weight of fear and uncertainty had been lifted from Martha's shoulders, and she seemed years younger. She and Jake talked easily as they rode, making plans for the ranch's future and discussing the gold mine that would change everything. "We need to be smart about this," Jake said as they made camp on their second night. "If we suddenly start spending gold, people will ask questions. We should work the mine slowly, quietly, and only take what we need." Martha nodded, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Samuel was right to be careful. "But I don't want to live in fear the way he did. We'll be cautious, but we'll also live our lives." When they reached the ranch, they found that news of their victory had already spread. Neighbors came by to congratulate Martha and to hear the story firsthand. Sheriff Brennan, who had been conspicuously absent during William's reign of terror, suddenly became very interested in Martha's welfare. "I always suspected something wasn't right about those rustling incidents," he claimed, though Jake noticed he couldn't quite meet Martha's eyes when he said it. Over the following weeks, Jake and Martha began the careful process of working Samuel's gold mine. They took turns standing guard while the other worked, always alert for signs of trouble. The gold they extracted was of excellent quality, and even taking small amounts, they soon had enough to pay off all of the ranch's debts. The transformation was remarkable. Martha no longer had the haunted look that had marked her face when Jake first arrived. She smiled more easily, laughed at his jokes, and began making plans for improvements to the ranch. Jake found himself looking forward to their evening conversations more than anything else in his day. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Martha brought up a subject that had been on both their minds. "Jake," she said softly, "I've been thinking about what happens next. The ranch is secure now, the mine is producing well, and William is in prison. You've done everything you promised and more." Jake felt a stab of fear. Was she about to tell him his job was finished, that she no longer needed him? "What are you saying, Martha?" "I'm saying that you're free to go if you want to. You've earned enough money to buy your own place, start your own ranch. You don't have to stay here out of obligation." Jake was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Martha, I didn't stay here out of obligation. I stayed because this feels like home, because you feel like home." Martha turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Jake, I'm 42 years old. I'm a widow with a complicated past and enemies who might still be out there. You're young, with your whole life ahead of you. You could find someone your own age, someone without all my baggage." Jake reached over and took her hand. "Martha, age is just a number. What matters is how I feel about you and how you feel about me. I love you. I love your strength, your courage, your kindness. I love the way you make me want to be a better man." Tears were flowing freely down Martha's cheeks now. "I love you too, Jake, more than I thought possible. But are you sure? Are you really sure this is what you want?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Jake said, dropping to one knee beside her chair. "Martha Henley, will you marry me?" Martha's yes was barely a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound Jake had ever heard. The wedding took place in the small church in Clearwater Valley on a crisp October morning. The entire community turned out to celebrate, including many of the neighbors who had initially been skeptical of the young cowboy and the widow. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony, and the church was filled with wildflowers from the meadows around the ranch. Martha wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her perfectly, and Jake had bought a new suit from the Denver tailor. But it was the look of pure joy on both their faces that made the ceremony memorable. They had found love in the most unlikely circumstances, forged in danger and sealed with trust. After the ceremony, the celebration continued at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and music provided by a local fiddle player. As the evening wore on and the guests began to head home, Jake and Martha found themselves alone on the porch where they had shared so many important conversations. "So, Mrs. Morrison," Jake said, trying out Martha's new name, "what do you think our future holds?" Martha smiled, leaning against her new husband's shoulder. "I think we'll work the mine carefully, build up the ranch, and maybe start a family if we're blessed that way. I think we'll face whatever challenges come our way together, the way we always have. And if more trouble comes looking for us, then we'll handle it," Martha said confidently. "We make a good team, Jake Morrison, we've proven that." As the stars appeared overhead, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had arrived in Clearwater Valley as a young cowboy with nothing but his horse and his determination to work hard. He was ending the day as a married man with a home, a family, and a future filled with possibilities. The gold mine would provide security, but the real treasure was the love he had found with Martha. They had both learned that the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in gold or silver, but in trust, loyalty, and the willingness to stand by someone through the darkest times. Their story would become legend in the valley, passed down through generations as an example of how love could triumph over greed, how courage could overcome fear, and how two people who trusted each other could face any challenge the world might throw at them. As they headed inside to begin their new life together, Jake knew that whatever the future held, they would face it side by side, partners in every sense of the word. The young cowboy had found his home, and the widow had found her second chance at happiness. It was the perfect ending to a story that had begun with such uncertainty and danger, but had ended with hope, love, and the promise of a bright future together.